3 times a day, the weathered outlaw cleans the wounds of a trembling black girl he found collapsed by the river, her blood-stained fingers clutching secrets that could topple empires. The townspeople call her cursed, another worthless runaway destined for an unmarked grave. They mock her torn dress and fearful whispers, already writing her obituary in their sneering glances. But this notorious gunslinger sees something they've missed, intelligence flickering behind her terror, and a leather satchel she guards like her very soul. As he tends her injuries with surprising gentleness, neither realizes she carries documented proof of the territory's most powerful cattle baron's crimes. The evidence could free hundreds of stolen lands and expose corruption reaching the highest government levels. Yet deadly men circle closer each day, hunting the girl who can read their master's darkest secrets. Will 3 daily acts of mercy be enough to keep them both alive long enough to change history? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth near Copper Ridge as Susan Walker stumbled toward the muddy river. Her dress hung in tatters, dried blood caked her arms, and clutched against her chest was a leather satchel she refused to release, even as consciousness slipped away. Her knees buckled. She collapsed face first into the shallow water. The first person to find her was Jake Morrison, a local merchant heading to town with his wagon. He pulled his horses to a stop and stared down at the motionless figure. After a long moment, he spat into the dust. "Ain't my problem," he muttered, snapping the reins. His wagon rolled past without stopping. Word spread quickly through Copper Ridge. The blacksmith's wife crossed herself when she heard. The saloon keeper shook his head knowingly. By afternoon, a small crowd had gathered near the general store, voices low but opinions loud. "Another runaway, I'd wager," said Mrs. Patterson, adjusting her bonnet. "They never last long out here." "Cursed, more like," added the baker. "Best to let nature take its course." Sheriff William Crenshaw emerged from his office, badge catching the sunlight. He'd heard the chatter and seen the worried glances. A few townspeople approached him hopefully. "Sheriff, shouldn't someone check on her?" Crenshaw barely looked up from cleaning his fingernails with a knife. "Not worth the paperwork. She'll be buzzard food by morning." The crowd dispersed, shaking their heads, but satisfied that someone in authority had spoken. By evening, Susan Walker was already a ghost story in their minds. Just another lost soul the desert would claim. But 20 miles north, Jedediah Cross had different concerns. The wanted outlaw crouched beside his horse at the same river, letting the animal drink while he scanned the horizon. 3 years of running had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts screamed danger. The $500 bounty on his head meant every sheriff, bounty hunter, and desperate fool in the territory wanted him dead or alive. Preferably dead. It was simpler that way. His horse snorted and stepped sideways, ears pricked forward. Jed followed the animal's gaze and saw her. A young woman lay motionless in the shallows, her dark skin stark against the pale sand. The leather satchel remained pressed to her chest like a shield. Jed's hand moved instinctively to his gun. This could be a trap. Plenty of lawmen used bait to catch bigger fish. But as he studied the scene, doubt crept in. The blood looked real. The shallow breathing looked real. The terror etched into her unconscious face looked very real. Something about her reminded him of Mary. His sister had been barely 18 when fever took her, leaving Jed alone with nothing but guilt and a growing reputation for violence. Mary had always believed people deserved help, even when they couldn't help themselves, especially then. Jed cursed under his breath and waded into the water. Susan's eyes fluttered open as strong arms lifted her from the river. Panic seized her immediately. She tried to struggle, but her body had no strength left. "Easy now," Jed's voice was rough but not unkind. "I'm not going to hurt you." She wanted to speak, to warn him, to explain the danger she carried. Instead, darkness claimed her again. Jed carried her to an abandoned cabin he'd discovered weeks earlier, hidden in the hills above the river. The previous owner had died or moved on, leaving behind 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak much. It wasn't paradise, but it was shelter. He laid Susan on the single bed and began assessing her injuries. Cuts and bruises covered her arms and legs. Her dress was torn in several places, but nothing appeared life-threatening if treated properly. 3 times that first day, Jed cleaned her wounds with water from his canteen. He had no medical training, but Mary had taught him the basics before she died. Keep wounds clean. Keep the patient warm. Keep watch for fever. On the second day, Susan woke delirious with fever. She mumbled words that made no sense, clutching the leather satchel like her life depended on it. Jed tried to take it so she could rest more comfortably, but even in her weakened state, she fought him off with surprising determination. "The Viper's men," she whispered through cracked lips. "They'll come when the moon rises. They always come when the moon rises." Jed had heard of Marcus Valdez, known throughout the territory as the Viper. The cattle baron owned more land than some eastern states and had enough hired guns to start his own war. But Jed had never crossed paths with Valdez's operation. He wondered what this girl had done to attract such dangerous attention. By the third day, Susan's fever broke. She woke to find Jed cleaning her wounds again with careful, gentle movements. The kindness in his actions confused her more than anything else she'd experienced. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jed paused in his work. "Everyone deserves help." It was a simple answer, but Susan heard something deeper in his tone. Pain, maybe. Or loss. She studied his weathered face and saw something unexpected. Despite the hard lines and suspicious eyes of a man who lived by violence, there was gentleness in how he handled her injuries. Meanwhile, in Copper Ridge, Sheriff Crenshaw received an unwelcome visitor. Marcus Valdez himself rode into town with 6 armed men, his black coat billowing behind him like wings. The cattle baron rarely made personal appearances, which meant the situation was serious. "I'm looking for a girl," Valdez told the sheriff without preamble. "Young, dark-skinned, carrying something that belongs to me. There's $100 for information leading to her recovery." Crenshaw's eyes lit up at the mention of money. "Might be I heard something about a runaway by the river. Of course, she's probably dead by now." "She'd better not be." Valdez's voice carried the promise of violence. "That girl has something very important to my business operations. I want her found." Within hours, wanted posters appeared throughout Copper Ridge. But the description was vague enough that it could fit dozens of young women. The reward, however, was specific enough to motivate every desperate soul in the territory. Back in the hidden cabin, Susan had grown strong enough to sit up and take solid food, but every sunset brought fresh terror to her eyes. She watched the windows obsessively as shadows lengthened across the floor. "They're coming," she told Jed for the 10th time. "The Viper doesn't forget. He doesn't forgive." Jed checked his weapons and settled into the chair by the door. Let them come. But Susan knew something Jed didn't. The leather satchel she guarded so fiercely contained more than personal belongings. Hidden within its folds were documents that could destroy Marcus Valdez's empire and expose corruption reaching the highest levels of territorial government. The question was whether a wanted outlaw and a terrified girl could survive long enough for those secrets to matter. Outside, the moon began to rise, casting long shadows across the New Mexico hills. And in those shadows, armed men on horseback moved steadily toward the cabin where 2 unlikely allies prepared to face whatever darkness the night might bring. Susan's strength returned slowly over the following days. The fever had broken, but fear remained constant in her eyes. She watched Jed's every movement with careful attention, as if memorizing his habits might somehow keep danger at bay. On the 4th morning, Jed found her sitting up in bed, staring intently at something in her hands. He approached quietly, expecting to see her examining the mysterious leather satchel again. Instead, she held his wanted poster, the one he'd carelessly left on the wooden table. But Susan wasn't looking at his photograph. Her eyes moved across the printed words with fluid precision. Her lips silently forming each syllable. She read every line of text describing his crimes, the reward amount, even the fine print at the bottom. Jed froze. In his experience, most people in the territory could barely write their own names. Education was a luxury reserved for wealthy Eastern families, certainly not for young women who looked like Susan. "You can read." Susan's head snapped up, panic flashing across her features. She quickly set the poster aside and looked away. "No, I was just looking at the picture." "You were reading every word on that paper." The silence stretched between them like a loaded gun. Susan's hands trembled as she reached for her leather satchel, holding it protectively against her chest. Years of hiding had taught her that revealing her education meant revealing her value to dangerous men. But something in Jed's expression made her pause. Not greed or calculation, but genuine curiosity, maybe even respect. "Miss Elizabeth taught me," she whispered finally. "She said knowledge was the only thing they could never steal from me." "Who was Miss Elizabeth?" Susan's voice grew stronger as she spoke about her teacher. Elizabeth Hartwell had come from Boston, part of a network of Northern abolitionists working to educate freed slaves in the territories. She'd found Susan as a child and recognized exceptional intelligence behind frightened eyes. "She disguised my lessons," Susan explained. "Told people I was just helping with cleaning and cooking. But every night she taught me to read, write, do mathematics. She said I had a gift that could change things." Jed sat down across from her, his weathered hands clasped together. "What happened to her?" Pain flickered across Susan's features. "Men came one night. They said she was helping runaways escape. They burned her house with her inside." The weight of that loss settled between them. Jed understood the particular grief of watching someone good destroyed by someone evil. It was a pain that never fully healed. "The satchel," he said gently. "What's inside it?" Susan's grip tightened on the leather bag. For a moment, Jed thought she might retreat back into silence. Then she opened it carefully, revealing not personal belongings, but carefully organized documents. "Miss Elizabeth always said I should pay attention to everything," Susan began. "When they took me to work for Marcus Valdez, she told me to watch and remember." She pulled out a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat handwriting in multiple hands. Names, dates, amounts of money, land descriptions with precise boundaries, legal documents with official seals. "I cleaned his office every day," Susan continued. "Valdez thought I couldn't read, so he left papers everywhere. But I could understand every word, every crime." Jed studied the open ledger with growing amazement. The documents detailed a systematic operation of fraud spanning years. Forged deeds transferring Mexican and Native American lands to Valdez's name. Bills of sale for people treated as property. Bribes paid to territorial officials. "This is why they want you back," he realized. Valdez discovered I could read his private correspondence. He realized I'd seen everything. Susan's voice dropped to a whisper. "He knows I have evidence that could destroy him." The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. This wasn't just about one man's crimes. The ledger documented corruption reaching into territorial government, federal land offices, even banking institutions. The scope was staggering. "How many people know about this?" "Just you now. Miss Elizabeth died before I could show her everything." Susan opened the satchel further, revealing additional materials. Books on law and mathematics, writing supplies carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, even a small slate for practicing letters. She made me promise to keep learning, no matter what happened to her. An idea formed in Jed's mind. "Could you teach me?" Susan looked surprised. "You want to learn to read?" "Never had the chance as a boy. Always figured it was too late now." Something shifted in Susan's expression. The fear remained, but underneath it, Jed saw purpose awakening. Teaching had been her dream before circumstances turned her into a fugitive. They started that very afternoon. Susan used charcoal from the fireplace to write letters on smooth pieces of wood. She began with Jed's name, showing him how each letter connected to sounds he already knew. "J for Jed," she explained patiently. "He makes the sound in bed. D is sharp, like the end of mad." Jed's calloused fingers struggled to form the letters, but Susan's teaching method made sense. She connected everything to familiar words and concepts, building understanding piece by piece. As the days passed, their lessons became routine. Morning wound care, Afternoon reading practice. Evening discussions about the documents in Susan's satchel. Jed proved surprisingly quick to learn, his adult mind able to grasp concepts that might confuse children, but their peaceful routine was living on borrowed time. In Copper Ridge, Marcus Valdez had grown impatient with Sheriff Crenshaw's lack of results. The cattle baron had dispatched his most trusted enforcer, Iron Pete Morrison, to conduct a more thorough search. Iron Pete was methodical where Crenshaw had been lazy. He questioned every person who might have seen Susan. He searched every building that could provide shelter, and he was getting closer to the hidden cabin with each passing day. Susan sensed the approaching danger even before they saw the dust clouds on the horizon. Her nightmares had returned, filled with visions of burning buildings and men on horseback. "We have to leave," she told Jed urgently. "They're coming. I can feel it." Jed wanted to dismiss her fears as trauma, but his own instincts had kept him alive this long. If Susan said danger was approaching, he believed her. They packed quickly, taking only essential supplies and the precious documents. Susan wrapped the ledger carefully in oiled cloth, ensuring it would survive whatever journey lay ahead. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had become their sanctuary, Susan made a decision that would change everything. "We have to get these documents to someone who can use them," she said, holding up the ledger. "Someone with the authority to bring Valdez to justice." The territorial capital, Jed realized. Santa Fe. It was a dangerous journey for a wanted outlaw and a hunted woman. But as they mounted Jed's horse and rode toward an uncertain future, both understood they carried more than evidence of crimes. They carried the possibility of justice for everyone Valdez had harmed. Behind them, dust clouds grew larger on the horizon as Iron Pete Morrison and his men closed in on the abandoned cabin where their quarry had been hiding. The journey to Santa Fe took them through territory neither had traveled before. Jed avoided the main roads where bounty hunters might recognize his face, choosing instead to follow deer trails and dried creek beds that wound through the harsh landscape. Susan rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, the precious satchel pressed between them. On their third day of travel, they encountered their first refugees. A Mexican family sat beside their broken wagon, the father trying to repair a wheel while his wife and 3 children waited in whatever shade they could find. Their belongings were scattered around them like the remnants of a life torn apart. Jed approached cautiously, his hand near his gun, but Susan slid down from the horse and walked directly toward the family, speaking to them in fluent Spanish. The conversation was animated, filled with gestures toward the distant mountains and expressions of shared grief. "What did they tell you?" Jed asked when Susan returned. "Valdez's men came to their village last month," she replied, her voice tight with anger. "They had papers saying the land belonged to him now, official papers with territorial seals." The family's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Generations of their ancestors had farmed the same valley. But suddenly their ownership meant nothing. Armed men had given them one day to leave everything behind. Susan opened her satchel and showed the father one of the documents from Valdez's ledger. His eyes widened as he recognized the description of his own land, complete with the forged signatures that had stolen it. "This is evidence," Susan explained to Jed, "proof that his family's land was taken illegally." She spent the next hour carefully documenting the family's testimony, writing their story in the margins of her notebook. Names, dates, descriptions of the men who had forced them from their home. Every detail that might help build a case against Valdez. As they prepared to leave, the father pressed something into Susan's hand. It was a small wooden cross carved by his grandfather. "For luck," he said in broken English, "and for justice." They encountered more displaced families over the following days. Each story added weight to the evidence Susan carried. Valdez's operation wasn't limited to a few isolated crimes. It was systematic theft on a massive scale, enabled by corrupt officials and enforced by hired guns. The constant documentation took its toll on Susan. She wrote by firelight each evening, her handwriting growing smaller as she tried to fit every testimony onto the limited pages in her notebook. The scope of suffering she recorded seemed to age her before Jed's eyes. "You don't have to carry all of this," he told her one night as she worked by the dying embers of their campfire. "Yes, I do," she replied without looking up. "Miss Elizabeth always said that bearing witness was a sacred duty. If I don't tell their stories, who will?" Their evening reading lessons continued despite the difficult circumstances. Susan had progressed from teaching Jed individual letters to helping him read simple sentences from the legal documents. His progress amazed them both. "You have a natural mind for this," Susan observed as Jed successfully read through a property deed. "Miss Elizabeth would have said you were born to be a scholar." The compliment meant more to Jed than Susan could have known. All his life, people had seen only his skill with weapons and his reputation for violence. The idea that he might have intellectual gifts felt like discovering a hidden part of himself. But their peaceful moments were increasingly rare. Each day brought signs that they were being pursued. Dust clouds on distant ridges, campfire smoke that appeared and disappeared too quickly. The nervous behavior of their horse when the wind shifted direction. Susan's nightmares returned with increasing intensity. She would wake gasping, clutching the satchel, her eyes wide with terror. "They're getting closer," she would whisper. "I can feel them coming." On their 7th day of travel, they created a hill and saw Santa Fe spread out below them like a promise of civilization. Adobe buildings caught the morning sunlight. Church bells echoed across the valley. For a moment, both felt hope that their dangerous journey might soon be over. But as they descended toward the territorial capital, Jed noticed something that made his blood run cold. Sheriff Crenshaw's distinctive black horse was tied outside the Territorial Administration building. The corrupt lawman had beaten them to Santa Fe. "He's already here," Jed told Susan grimly. "Whatever story he's telling, they're hearing it first." They found lodging at a small inn on the outskirts of town, paying with coins Jed had saved from his outlaw days. The innkeeper looked suspicious of the unlikely pair, but money spoke louder than prejudice. Susan spent the evening preparing their case with meticulous care. She organized the documents by type of crime, cross-referenced the testimonies they'd collected, and prepared a clear summary of Valdez's criminal enterprise. Her legal mind, trained by Miss Elizabeth, understood that presentation would be crucial. The next morning, they walked to the territorial courthouse with hope and determination. Susan carried herself with dignity, her head high despite the stares and whispers that followed them down the street. The precious satchel was clutched firmly in her hands. Inside the courthouse, they were directed to the office of Territorial Administrator James Whitman. The man behind the desk looked up with barely concealed annoyance as they entered. "We have evidence of criminal activity," Jed began. "Land fraud, corruption, systematic theft." Whitman's expression grew colder. "Are you referring to the mentally unstable young woman Sheriff Crenshaw warned us about? The one who's been making wild accusations?" Susan stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Sir, I have documented evidence of crimes committed by Marcus Valdez, forged deeds, bribed officials, stolen lands." But Whitman was already shaking his head. "Sheriff Crenshaw explained your condition, girl. These are the ravings of someone who doesn't understand legal documents." "I can read every word of these documents," Susan protested, opening her satchel. "Impossible," Whitman scoffed. "Sheriff Crenshaw says you're illiterate. He's arranging for your return to proper supervision." The crushing realization hit them both simultaneously. Crenshaw hadn't just arrived first. He'd poisoned the well, making it impossible for anyone to take Susan's evidence seriously. Before they could respond, 2 territorial marshals entered the office. "Jedediah Cross," one announced. "You're under arrest for kidnapping and corruption of a ward of the territory." As the handcuffs closed around Jed's wrists, Susan felt her world collapsing. The evidence that could free hundreds of people was being dismissed as the fantasies of an unstable mind. Everything Miss Elizabeth had taught her about justice and truth seemed meaningless in the face of institutional corruption. But as they led Jed away, he caught her eye one final time. "Don't give up," he said quietly. "The truth doesn't change just because they refuse to hear it." Susan clutched her satchel tighter and made a silent promise. Somehow, somewhere, She would find someone who would listen. The stories of all those displaced families deserved better than to die in the darkness of willful ignorance. The question was whether she could survive long enough to find that someone, and whether the truth would matter when she did. The Santa Fe jail reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. Jed sat on a narrow wooden bench, his hands still bearing the marks where the handcuffs had chafed his wrists. The cell he shared with 3 other men was barely large enough for them to lie down, but space was the least of his concerns. Susan had been taken to a separate facility, supposedly for her own protection, while arrangements were made for her return to Valdez. The thought of her facing that monster alone made Jed's stomach twist with rage and helplessness. His cellmates were a collection of petty thieves and drunks, none particularly interested in conversation. But late on his second night in jail, a new prisoner arrived who changed everything. Judge Thomas Hartwell entered the cell with quiet dignity, despite the circumstances of his arrest. The man was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. Unlike the other prisoners, he carried himself with an air of authority that even iron bars couldn't diminish. "You're Jedediah Cross," the judge said, settling onto the bench beside Jed. It wasn't a question. Jed studied the older man carefully. "You're not what I expected from a territorial judge. And you're not what I expected from a kidnapper." Hartwell's tone held no judgment, only curiosity. "Tell me about the young woman you're accused of taking." Something in the judge's manner encouraged honesty. Jed found himself describing Susan's intelligence, her courage, and the remarkable documents she carried. He explained about the systematic fraud they'd uncovered, and the evidence that could expose Valdez's criminal empire. Hartwell listened without interruption, his expression growing more intense with each revelation. When Jed finished, the judge sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. "The woman who taught her to read," Hartwell said finally, "Elizabeth Hartwell. She was my sister." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. He stared at the judge with new understanding, seeing the family resemblance he'd missed before. The same intelligent eyes, the same quiet strength. "Elizabeth wrote to me about a gifted student," Hartwell continued, his voice heavy with grief. "A young woman with exceptional intelligence who could help change things if given the chance. I've been searching for that student since my sister died." "Susan," Jed whispered. "You've been looking for Susan." Hartwell nodded slowly. "I've been investigating Valdez for months, but I lacked concrete evidence. My sister's letters mentioned documents, but I could never locate them." The judge leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not just a territorial judge, Jedediah. I'm part of a network of officials working to expose the corruption that's poisoning this territory. We've been waiting for someone with the evidence and courage to help us bring these criminals to justice." Hope flickered in Jed's chest for the first time since their arrest. "Can you get to Susan? Can you protect her?" "That's exactly what I intend to do." Hartwell's expression hardened with determination. "But first, you need to understand what we're really fighting. This goes beyond Valdez. Sheriff Crenshaw, Administrator Whitman, half the territorial government has been bought or intimidated into compliance." The judge explained the scope of the corruption with clinical precision. Land fraud was just one piece of a larger criminal enterprise that included human trafficking, tax evasion, and systematic theft of federal funds meant for territorial development. "Your Susan doesn't just have evidence of crimes," Hartwell said. "She has evidence of treason." That evening, Hartwell's network moved into action. A sympathetic guard unlocked Susan's cell during a shift change. A trusted clerk provided her with legal documents establishing her as an official witness under federal protection. Within hours, she was spirited away from the facility where Valdez's men had been preparing to collect her. Susan found herself in a safe house operated by reformed territorial officials and abolitionists working together toward justice. The leader of this group was a woman named Maria Santos, whose own family had lost their land to Valdez's schemes. "Judge Hartwell sent word," Maria explained as she provided Susan with clean clothes and hot food. "He says you carry proof that can stop these thieves once and for all." For the first time since leaving the hidden cabin, Susan felt safe enough to spread out all her documents. Under the protection of the network, she could work without fear of immediate capture. The safe house became a center of intense activity. Susan worked with legal experts to verify and organize her evidence. They cross-referenced her testimonies with official land records, revealing the full scope of Valdez's fraudulent empire. Meanwhile, Judge Hartwell used his position to gather additional evidence from within the territorial government. He discovered that Valdez had been selling stolen lands to Eastern investors, using forged federal documents to legitimize the transactions. "This isn't just territorial crime," Hartwell explained to Susan when they finally met face to face. "This is federal fraud involving interstate commerce. That gives us jurisdiction beyond Valdez's corrupted local influence." Susan stared at the man who had been her teacher's brother, seeing Elizabeth's kindness reflected in his determined expression. "She wrote about you," Susan said softly. "Elizabeth always said you were fighting the good fight from inside the system. And she always said you were the key to winning that fight." Hartwell placed a gentle hand on Susan's shoulder. "Are you ready to help us bring these criminals to justice?" The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than fighting corruption through corrupted channels, they would bypass the territorial system entirely. Federal authorities would be contacted directly with evidence of interstate fraud and violation of federal land laws. But their activities hadn't gone unnoticed. Sheriff Crenshaw had discovered Susan's disappearance and was pressuring every official contact to locate her. Valdez had arrived in Santa Fe personally, bringing an army of hired guns to retrieve his escaped witness. The network faced a critical decision. They could keep Susan hidden and try to smuggle the evidence out of the territory, or they could make a bold public stand that would expose everything but put everyone at risk. "There's a territorial assembly meeting scheduled for tomorrow," Hartwell explained. "Every major official will be present, including federal representatives visiting from Washington. If we could get Susan before that assembly with her evidence." "They'll never let her speak," Maria protested. "Crenshaw and his people control access to those meetings." Susan had been listening quietly to the debate, but now she spoke with quiet determination. "Then we make them listen." She pulled out her carefully organized documents, her notebooks filled with testimonies, her teacher's legal texts that had guided her understanding of justice. Everything Elizabeth Hartwell had died to preserve was contained in these materials. "Miss Elizabeth always taught me that truth has power," Susan said, her voice growing stronger. "Not because it's convenient or comfortable, but because it's true. These people have been silenced for too long. These crimes have been hidden for too long." Judge Hartwell studied Susan's resolute expression and saw his sister's courage reflected there. The network had been searching for someone with the evidence to expose Valdez's crimes, but perhaps what they really needed was someone with the courage to stand up and tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. The question now was whether one young woman's testimony could overcome a system designed to silence voices like hers, and whether justice could prevail when so many powerful people had invested in maintaining injustice. The territorial courthouse buzzed with activity as officials, landowners, and curious citizens filled every available seat. Word had spread that something significant would happen at today's assembly, though few understood exactly what that might be. Federal representatives from Washington sat in the front row, their presence lending unusual gravity to the proceedings. Susan stood in a small anteroom behind the main hall, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. She wore a simple but dignified dress provided by Maria Santos, and her hair was arranged in a neat style that emphasized her intelligence rather than hiding it. The precious satchel sat open on a nearby table, its contents organized with meticulous precision. Judge Hartwell reviewed the legal documents one final time. "The federal representatives have agreed to hear testimony regarding interstate commerce violations," he explained. "Once you begin speaking, territorial law requires they allow you to finish. And if Crenshaw tries to stop me, he'll be violating federal jurisdiction in front of federal witnesses." Hartwell's expression was grim but determined. Even he's not foolish enough to risk that. Through the anteroom's small window, Susan could see Jed being escorted into the courtroom under guard. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space, and she saw him nod with quiet encouragement. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Marcus Valdez sat in the gallery like a king holding court, surrounded by his hired men and corrupt officials. His presence was meant to intimidate, to remind everyone in the room where real power resided. But Susan had moved beyond intimidation into something far more dangerous to men like Valdez: absolute moral certainty. Administrator Whitman called the assembly to order and began reading routine territorial business: land grants, tax assessments, minor legal disputes. The mundane proceedings seemed designed to lull the audience into boredom before the real drama began. The next matter involves accusations of irregular land transfers, Whitman announced with obvious reluctance. Federal representatives have requested testimony regarding interstate commerce implications. Judge Hartwell rose from his seat. The territory calls Susan Walker to provide sworn testimony regarding systematic fraud in territorial land management. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Susan walked calmly to the witness stand. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her head held high despite the hostile stares from Valdez's supporters. The federal representatives leaned forward with obvious interest. Sheriff Crenshaw immediately stood up. "Your Honor, this woman is mentally unstable and under territorial protection. She lacks the capacity to provide reliable testimony." Susan looked directly at Crenshaw, her voice clear and unwavering. "Sheriff, I can read every word of the territorial constitution hanging behind your head, including the section about citizens' rights to petition for redress of grievances." Shocked silence filled the courtroom. Susan's articulate response had instantly demolished Crenshaw's claims about her mental capacity. Even Valdez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Hartwell approached the witness stand with Susan's organized documents. "Miss Walker, please describe for this assembly what these materials contain." Susan opened the leather ledger with practiced ease. "These are financial records documenting systematic land fraud perpetrated by Marcus Valdez and his associates. The fraud includes forged federal land patents, bribed territorial officials, and illegal sales to Eastern investors." She began reading entries from the ledger, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom: names, dates, amounts of money, property descriptions with precise boundaries. The methodical recitation of crimes was devastating in its thoroughness. Valdez's lawyer, a thin man named Patterson, jumped to his feet. "Objection. This woman lacks the education to understand complex legal documents. She's clearly been coached to repeat accusations she cannot comprehend." Susan calmly opened one of her teacher's law books and read aloud a passage about federal land patent requirements. Then she explained in detail how Valdez's documents violated those requirements, citing specific legal precedents and territorial statutes. The federal representatives exchanged amazed glances. This wasn't the testimony of a coached witness, but the analysis of someone with genuine legal understanding. "Miss Walker," one of the federal representatives asked, "how did you acquire this knowledge of territorial law?" Susan's voice softened with memory. "I was taught by Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, who believed education could overcome any obstacle. She died helping people whose rights had been stolen by men like Marcus Valdez." The mention of Elizabeth Hartwell's murder sent another wave of whispers through the courtroom. Judge Hartwell's sister had been well known among reform-minded officials, and her death had been widely mourned. Susan continued her testimony with methodical precision. She presented testimony from displaced families, cross-referenced with official land records that proved their legal ownership. She showed receipts for bribes paid to territorial officials, including several sitting in the courtroom. "These crimes extend beyond territorial boundaries," Susan explained, opening a section of documents she'd saved for maximum impact. "Mr. Valdez has been selling fraudulently obtained lands to investors in New York, Chicago, and Boston. The interstate nature of these crimes makes them federal violations." The federal representatives were taking detailed notes now, clearly recognizing the significance of what they were hearing. This wasn't just territorial corruption, but systematic fraud involving multiple states and federal land policies. Crenshaw made one desperate attempt to interrupt. "I'm placing this woman under arrest for making false accusations against territorial officials." Judge Hartwell stood immediately. "Sheriff, you are attempting to interfere with federal testimony in the presence of federal representatives. That constitutes obstruction of federal justice." The lead federal representative spoke with quiet authority. "Sheriff Crenshaw, you will allow this testimony to continue or face federal charges yourself." Crenshaw sat down heavily, realizing his powerlessness in the face of federal jurisdiction. Valdez's expression had shifted from confident arrogance to barely controlled fury. Susan spent the next hour systematically dismantling Valdez's criminal empire with facts, figures, and legal analysis that impressed even skeptical observers. She presented evidence linking territorial officials to the fraud, including detailed records of bribes and kickbacks. When she finished, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The scope and detail of the evidence was overwhelming. Federal crimes had been documented with the precision of a legal scholar and the passion of someone who had witnessed injustice firsthand. The lead federal representative stood to address the assembly. Based on this testimony and supporting evidence, federal authorities will be initiating immediate investigations into interstate fraud, violation of federal land patents, and corruption of territorial officials. Valdez's carefully constructed empire was crumbling in real time, destroyed by the testimony of a young woman he had dismissed as powerless and ignorant. The man who had terrorized the territory through violence and corruption now faced the one thing he couldn't intimidate or buy: documented truth presented with unshakable moral authority. Susan stepped down from the witness stand, knowing she had honored her teacher's memory and given voice to everyone Valdez had silenced. The truth had finally found its audience, and justice was no longer just a dream, but an approaching reality. The federal investigation moved with swift efficiency. Within 48 hours of Susan's testimony, federal marshals had arrested Marcus Valdez on charges of interstate fraud, violation of federal land patents, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. His empire of stolen lands and corrupted officials collapsed like a house built on sand. Sheriff Crenshaw found himself stripped of his badge and facing federal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The man who had dismissed Susan as worthless was now begging federal prosecutors for leniency. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Jed walked out of the territorial jail a free man, his cooperation with federal authorities earning him complete clemency for his past crimes. The bounty on his head was officially lifted, replaced with an offer to serve as a territorial marshal, helping to clean up the corruption his testimony had exposed. Judge Hartwell was promoted to the Territorial Supreme Court, his integrity and courage during the crisis earning him recognition from federal authorities. His network of reform-minded officials was no longer operating in secret, but leading the territory's transformation into a more just society. But the most profound changes were happening in the lands Valdez had stolen. Federal authorities moved quickly to restore properties to their rightful owners, using Susan's meticulous documentation to verify legitimate claims. Families who had been driven from their ancestral homes began the journey back to lands they thought they'd lost forever. Susan stood in what had once been Valdez's personal office, now serving as a coordination center for land restoration efforts. Maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins indicating properties being returned to displaced families. The room that had once planned criminal enterprises now worked to undo those crimes. The Mexican family they'd encountered on the road to Santa Fe was among the first to reclaim their land. The father wept openly when federal officials handed him the deed to his ancestral valley, the same land Valdez had stolen with forged documents. His children would grow up on soil their great-grandfathers had farmed. 37 families restored to their lands so far, Maria Santos reported, consulting her carefully maintained records, with more cases being processed every day. Susan nodded with quiet satisfaction, but her mind was already moving toward the future. Restoring stolen land was justice, but education was prevention. The territory needed schools, teachers, and citizens who could read legal documents and defend their rights. "I want to establish a school," she told Judge Hartwell during one of their planning meetings. "Not just for children, but for adults who never had the chance to learn." Hartwell smiled, seeing his sister's passion for education reflected in Susan's determined expression. "The territorial legislature has authorized funding for educational initiatives. Where would you like to build it?" Susan had already chosen the location. The valley where she and Jed had encountered the displaced Mexican family was central to many of the restored communities. The federal government had seized several of Valdez's buildings in the area, including a large ranch house that could easily be converted into classrooms. 3 months after the trial, Susan Walker's School for Community Education opened its doors. The first students were a mixture of children whose families had reclaimed their lands and adults who had never learned to read. Classes were conducted in both English and Spanish, with Susan teaching advanced students while training other teachers for basic instruction. Jed proved surprisingly effective as an assistant teacher, his own recent experience learning to read giving him insight into adult students' challenges. His presence also provided security for the school, his reputation ensuring that no one would threaten the students or teachers. The marriage ceremony took place in the school's main classroom, surrounded by students, restored families, and officials who had helped bring justice to the territory. Judge Hartwell performed the ceremony, speaking about the power of love built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Susan wore her teacher's wedding dress, carefully preserved by Maria Santos, who had retrieved it from Elizabeth Hartwell's burned home. The symbolism was profound. The torch of education and justice passing from teacher to student, from one generation to the next. The school's impact extended far beyond basic literacy. Students learned to read legal documents, understand their rights, and participate meaningfully in territorial governance. The voter registration drive Susan organized brought hundreds of previously voiceless citizens into the democratic process. Within a year, the territorial legislature looked dramatically different. Representatives who had been bought by men like Valdez were replaced by honest officials elected by informed constituents. Land fraud became virtually impossible when potential victims could read and understand the documents they were asked to sign. Federal authorities used Susan's school as a model for educational reform throughout the Western territories. Her methods of combining practical literacy with civic education proved remarkably effective at preventing the kind of systematic exploitation Valdez had practiced. The original blood-stained ledger that had started everything was donated to the Territorial Historical Society. It was displayed in a place of honor, labeled as the document that changed history. Visitors could read Susan's careful handwriting documenting crimes and see how one person's courage had transformed an entire region. 5 years after her testimony, Susan stood before her latest class of graduating students. Some were children who would go on to become teachers and lawyers. Others were adults who had learned to read their own property deeds and voting ballots. All carried forward the lesson Elizabeth Hartwell had taught Susan. Knowledge was power that could never be stolen. Jed entered the classroom carrying their infant daughter, a child who would grow up in a world where education was valued and justice was more than just a dream. The little girl gurgled happily as Susan concluded her graduation speech. Education is not just about reading words on a page, Susan told her students. It's about understanding your place in the world and having the courage to make that world better. Each of you carries that responsibility now. The applause that followed was heartfelt and genuine. These students understood that they were not just receiving an education, but inheriting a legacy of justice and moral courage. As the graduation ceremony ended and families celebrated their achievements, Susan reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 3 times a day, an outlaw had cleaned the wounds of a terrified girl. That simple act of mercy had grown into a transformation that touched hundreds of lives. The school bell rang across the valley, calling new students to evening classes. The sound carried on the wind to restored farmlands where families worked soil that truly belonged to them once again. In the distance, Judge Hartwell's courthouse dispensed justice, guided by law rather than corruption. Susan Walker had kept her promise to Miss Elizabeth Hartwell. Knowledge had indeed overcome oppression, and education had proven more powerful than violence. The truth had found its voice, and that voice continued to echo across the territory, teaching new generations that courage and compassion could indeed change history.